The torches flicker low in a corridor that shouldn't exist. Stone walls sweat in the heat, scented not with perfume, but with the must of forgotten flesh. Your footsteps echo against limestone carved by trembling hands. The air is tight, stale with silence. The hieroglyphs on the walls refuse to speak. They're not faded, just missing. As if scraped away by something desperate to forget. You don't know where you are yet. But you know you're somewhere you were never meant to be. A door groans open behind a veil of dust. Inside, sarcophagi lie unopened, not royal, not marked. Unloved. A tangle of linen still clings to the bones, embroidered not with titles, but with warnings. There's no offering table. No gold. Just the heavy quiet of unwept grief. You're standing before someone who died nameless, because her name was stolen. Outside, the priests chant prayers to Isis, to Hathor, to Ma'at. But in here, there's no goddess. Only the echo of a voice that never got to speak. Your skin prickles. Because it's not just one voice. It's dozens. Maybe hundreds. Girls who vanished behind palace walls, who bled for gods that turned their faces. Servants who were stripped of desire, of motherhood, of even memory, so they could watch over the concubines, guard the purity of pharaohs, and disappear without consequence. They were called many things: attendants, temple shadows, harem keepers. But none of them were true. Not really. Because what they were, was unspeakable. The eunuchs of Egypt were not all men. They praised the beauty of Nefertiti. They wrote poetry for Cleopatra. But what of the women who weren't allowed to be women at all? There is no statue to remember them. No scroll to recall their birth. Only corridors like this, hidden beneath the sand, behind sealed chambers, where their stories rot in silence. And yet, you found one. A linen scrap. A cracked jawbone. A line etched too faintly to read. But something in you knows, this was not an accident. This was erasure. And now you stand in the dark, surrounded by bones, asking the question the scribes were forbidden to write: what did Egypt do to its forgotten women? You step into the sun again, but the heat feels colder now. The sands shift beneath your feet like they know something you don't. Before you rises the outer wall of a forgotten city within a city, a place the records call the Perkentet, the house of royal women. But the guards once called it something else. The palace with no women. From the outside, it gleamed like paradise. Lotus gardens. Marble fountains. Gold filigree shimmering under the breath of Ra. But those who entered seldom returned, and those who stayed were not permitted to be seen. Not as women. Not as people. They were chosen young. Some were orphans. Others, daughters of priests offered like livestock to the temple. They were not concubines. They were not lovers. They were necessary. That was the word the scribes used when they bothered to describe them at all. Inside the palace, there were women of rank, wives, sisters, daughters of the pharaoh. Their beauty was legendary. Their wombs, political. Their presence, carefully preserved and constantly policed. But who did the policing? Not men. That would be impurity. No, the ones who watched them, the ones who bathed them, clothed them, bled with them in silence, were the others. Women, who were not permitted to be women. Their breasts were bound. Their hair, shaved. Their bodies wrapped tight in linen that denied every curve. They lived behind a second veil, beneath even the concubines. If they cried, it was behind stone walls that didn't echo. If they grew ill, they were taken to the underground infirmary, where the physicians had no names for their condition, only silence. They were reshaped by rules. They were carved by hierarchy. Their femininity wasn't lost, it was stolen, repurposed, erased. No marriage. No childbearing. No recognition. They walked between categories, neither servant nor queen. Neither slave nor sacred. Just, necessary. You wonder, who were they? Did they volunteer for this? Or were they born into roles designed to strip them of self? But the question that hits harder, heavier, and deeper is this: why has no one told their story? Where are their scrolls? Where are their names? If these women could be erased from 4,000 years of history, will you help bring their truth back? Or scroll past like everyone else? If you're one of the few who still care, subscribe. Because what comes next will not be found in a textbook. It will not be spoken by tour guides in Luxor or written on plaques in Cairo. It lives only in whispers, fragments passed down through shadow and dust. And you are one of the few still listening. Ma'at was the law behind the laws. Not a rule, but a rhythm. A divine alignment. Balance, harmony, truth, justice. Everything in Egypt. Every star, every grain of sand, every breath, was expected to obey it. And you? You were born into this order, not as an individual, but as a function. Man or woman. Priest or vessel. Pharaoh or dust. Deviation was not sin. It was danger. To step outside your station, your gender, your role in the sacred machinery, was to invite Isfet, chaos, the serpent of unmaking. And so Egypt did not tolerate the uncertain. It corrected it. Boys born without masculine strength were sent to the temple for discipline. Girls who failed to blossom into ideal wives were reformed, or repurposed. The records do not use the word sterilized. But they speak in symbols. A mouth sealed. A womb tied shut with reeds. A figure carved without breasts, head bowed in submission. The priests described these acts not as punishments, but as offerings. A woman who could not conceive could still serve, if she was purified. A woman who bled irregularly, or not at all, could be given to the temple for transformation. They called it consecration. But what was given was not taken gently. You find references buried in ritual texts, hints of ceremonies meant to strip away not only fertility, but identity. Long fasts. Isolation in dark cells. Baths in sacred oils that burned the skin raw. Then silence. These women were not marked as eunuchs. That word was reserved for the castrated males who guarded the treasury or advised the pharaoh. But functionally, spiritually, and socially, these women were neutered. Not with a blade. But with erasure. There are prayers for every stage of life in ancient Egypt: prayers for birth. Prayers for puberty. Prayers for marriage, motherhood, and death. But for these women? Nothing. The scrolls go quiet. The scribe's ink runs dry. The priests, so meticulous in recording offerings and sacrifices, left no liturgy for these human alterations. You begin to see it now, don't you? Egypt wasn't just obsessed with power, it was obsessed with purity. Not the purity of the body, but of its place in the divine machine. A woman's worth was in her order. A man's, in his purpose. Anyone who fell between was reshaped to fit. And when that didn't work, they were removed. From the records. From the stories. From memory. But not from the system. Because the system needed watchers. It needed shadows. It needed those who could move between roles without being fully recognized as either. They became the ghosts that kept Ma'at intact. If that terrifies you, it should. Because these were not monsters. They were not criminals. They were daughters. Sisters. Mothers who never got the chance. And the world forgot them, because forgetting was easier than justice. But forgetting doesn't undo the crime. It only buries the evidence. And you found a piece. You're holding it right now. What you do next matters. Will you bury it again, or help unearth what Egypt tried to keep hidden? Subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Let the forgotten know you heard them. And if you won't, if this story doesn't move you, then say it out loud in the comments. Tell the world why these women don't deserve remembrance. We're listening. The tomb walls are loud with stories. Of kings, of gods, of wives adored and enemies vanquished. Every surface etched in reverence. Every name, a chant to eternity. But as you move deeper into the sacred chambers of Egypt's dead, you start to notice something louder than the inscriptions. What isn't there? No carvings of the watchers. No murals of the women who stood behind the throne, who held the infants of kings, who swept blood from marble floors during temple rituals. No prayers for the unnamed who kept the order from crumbling. Not even a symbol. Their absence is not accidental. It is meticulous. You see depictions of eunuchs, men with narrow shoulders, stylized faces, and strange robes. Often marked with a curious glyph, NWNFR, a term historians have argued over for centuries. Some call it a ceremonial rank. Others, a euphemism for not whole. It appears rarely, and almost always in the margins. But then, you find something stranger. In the burial chamber of a lesser priestess, faded and nearly erased, is a variation, subtly feminine, almost defiant. A twist of the NFR glyph, the symbol of beauty and perfection, recarved in haste. It wasn't meant to be seen. And yet here you are. Why? Why would a civilization so obsessed with permanence go out of its way to remove these women? Was it shame? Was it fear? Or was it something deeper, something they knew even then? That there are some truths so unsettling, even the gods preferred them buried? A woman stripped of her gender without consent. A servant made to embody purity, yet unworthy of remembrance. A human being reshaped to serve the image of balance, without ever receiving balance herself. The scribes etched the triumphs of pharaohs in gold. They painted the eyes of the gods with lapis lazuli. They recorded the inventory of grain stores, the color of the Nile, the number of cattle offered to Horus. But not this. Not her. Not them. Their hands laid the foundations of palaces. Their silence padded the walls of the royal harem. Their eyes saw what no one else was allowed to see: betrayals, bloodlines, power taken and disguised. And in return, they were made invisible. You wonder what it does to a person, to be commanded to erase themselves every day they live. Not through death, but through survival. To walk past tombs that will never carry your name. To serve gods who will never grant you an afterlife. To hear your own language turn its face from you. It's easy to think they were forgotten. But no. They were forbidden. You're watching something 99% of people will never hear about. And if you leave without subscribing, you're letting their silence win again. Comment why you're okay with that. Tell us. Tell them. Why the ones who bore the weight of empires still don't deserve to be remembered. They bore no scars. At least, none you could see. No blades touched their flesh. No blood ran on the temple floors in their name. And yet they were altered just the same. These women, they were eunuchs without incisions. Changed not by knives, but by silence. Not through surgery, but through centuries of obedience to a system that told them what they could no longer be. The rituals were quiet. First, the removal of name. She was no longer called by her birth title, but referred to in terms of function: keeper, shadow, hand, voice. Then the removal of body. Her curves hidden beneath layers of linen, flattened by tight wrappings. Breasts bound. Hair shaved. Then the final cut, the removal of desire. No man was allowed to touch her. No child would ever grow within her. No lover would whisper her name in the night. Not because she chose that life, but because Ma'at demanded order. And order had no room for in-betweens. You start to see it not as punishment, but policy. An administrative function dressed in spiritual language. She wasn't barren, she was neutral. She wasn't enslaved, but she couldn't leave. She wasn't dead, but she didn't exist. The priests never used the word eunuch for them because that word had rules, terms, expectations, ceremonies. What these women endured had no ritual. No public naming. No declaration. No mourning. It was an erasure so subtle, even the victim was expected to believe it was holy. They were trained to disassociate from the self. Trained to bow before queens who envied them, and kings who ignored them. They stood guard at the gates of pleasure and power, forbidden to taste either. But worse than what was denied to them was what they were taught to deny within themselves. Desire became sin. Attachment, weakness. Grief, treason. Over time, the transformation became permanent. A woman born with laughter in her voice became silent. A girl once praised for her grace was told to walk like a servant, to look away, to become smaller than her body. This was not gender reassignment. It was identity erasure. And it worked. So well, in fact, that modern historians barely know where to begin. Their names do not appear in the temple rosters. Their tombs, if they exist, are unmarked. Their memories were outsourced to roles, and their roles were designed never to be remembered. They lived among slaves, but were not slaves. They stood beside priestesses, but were not spiritual. They worked like foreigners, but many were native-born. They were unnecessary to history, but vital to control. They were women without wounds, because the wound was the life itself. This is psychological eunuchism. A mutilation of the mind. A castration of spirit. A slow, suffocating transformation into a presence so neutral, so obedient, that even time lost interest in them. You can almost feel it now. The weight of a gaze that no longer expects to be seen. And as you stand here, piecing together fragments from a mosaic no one wanted completed, you realize, they were erased because they made the empire function. And no empire wants to thank its machinery. It only wants the illusion of divinity on the surface, while its gears rot beneath. But you're not on the surface anymore. You're here. In the machinery. Looking into the places even the gods refuse to see. And now you face the choice every witness must face: will you speak for the silenced? Or will you scroll like everyone else? Subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Lend your voice to theirs. Or enter the comments and explain why those whose bodies bore the burden of a kingdom still don't deserve remembrance. Her name was Sachet. Or perhaps, it was once. We don't know for sure, because what remains of her is a wound carved into stone. Her title scratched out, her figure chiseled blank, her memory crumbling beneath centuries of sun. But what we do know is this: she was there. She walked the halls of Karnak, one of the most sacred spaces in Egypt, where priests spoke in whispers and gods were said to breathe through walls. She wasn't a noble, nor a queen. She wore no crown, carried no staff, and bore no heir. But she was trusted. She moved close to the altar. Closer than most men. Close enough to brush the veil of the divine. And then, she vanished. Not from time, but from permission. You see it clearly on a fragment discovered near the northern gate, a procession scene, faces intact, titles engraved in calligraphic pride, except for one. The figure in the rear. Taller than most women. Head bowed. And where her name once sat, there is only gouged rock. Not time-worn erosion. Deliberate. Sharp. Personal. This is no accident. This is punishment. A priestess, perhaps. A guardian of the house of Ammonius. A member of the inner circle meant to uphold purity. And then, something happened. A refusal. The scrolls surrounding this period hint at unrest in the temple. A servant disciplined for breaking the silence of her duty. A report of someone impure by disobedience. A change in personnel, followed by an erasure. Some say she defied the high priest. Others whisper she refused the pharaoh himself. Perhaps denied a ritual coupling, or disobeyed a command to offer her body in the name of divine obedience. And for that? Her name was taken. Her image, struck. Her memory, unspoken. In Egypt, this was the worst fate imaginable. To die was nothing. To be forgotten, intentionally, was a second death. The kind that chained your soul to the earth, leaving it to wander without purpose, without offerings, without hope. Sachet became a cautionary echo. The message was clear: you do not say no. Not to the gods. Not to the priesthood. Not to the machinery that demanded your silence and your flesh. And so the chisel did what the knife never did. It unmade her. Her bones are likely dust. Her story, dustier still. And yet here you are, thousands of years later, staring at a blank patch of temple stone where a woman once dared to say, no, she had her name scraped from stone. Are we really going to let YouTube do the same by ignoring this story? Disturbing tale exists to restore what's lost. Prove you're not like the scribes, subscribe. Because if you walk away now, her silence continues. And the punishment remains complete. She walked beneath pillars carved for gods who never spoke her name. She lit incense with hands that would never hold a child. She bowed, prayed, fasted, bathed in cold water before dawn, every act an offering. Every breath a ritual. And yet, she was not seen. Not as woman. Not as self. Within the sanctums of the cult of Ammonius and the veil-drenched rituals of Isis, a class of temple servants emerged. They were not priestesses. They were not wives. They were what the priests called clean vessels, non-women consecrated through restriction, reshaped through discipline. They lived in chambers behind sanctuaries, walled off from the living world. Their heads were shaved smooth, stripped of feminine identity. They were forbidden from wearing jewelry, even if they came from noble families. Their robes, linen, unadorned, masculine in cut, hung like a statement: you do not belong to desire. You do not belong to yourself. Marriage was denied. Motherhood, forbidden. Even the possibility of affection was crushed beneath sacred law. To serve the gods, they were told, they must be neither man nor woman. Only presence. Only function. Only silence. This was not devotion, it was a slow removal of self. The line blurred, between the sacred and the stolen. Between holiness and humiliation. Between choosing to be pure and being forced to be invisible. Were they sacred? Or were they silenced? The rituals say one thing. The bones say another. Because some of their remains have been found, buried far from other temple workers. Bodies with no funerary markers. Teeth worn from fasting. Rib cages narrowed from decades of binding. Some were found with tokens of worship. Amulets of Isis pressed against their chest, but no names, no blessings, no offerings. They were necessary to the divine order. But never divine themselves. And still, they rose before the sun. They sang hymns that praised love and creation, knowing they would never be allowed either. They bowed before statues of goddesses with swollen bellies and braided hair, knowing their own womanhood had been traded for obedience. And all the while, the scribes wrote about balance. About honor. About purity. But they never wrote about pain. No scripture questions the cost of erasing a woman's life in the name of godliness. No temple admits how many daughters they buried beneath doctrine. You may be tempted to believe these women lived noble lives. That they accepted their roles with gratitude. But what you're feeling now, that ache in your chest, is the echo of every word they were never allowed to say. Because holiness without choice is not holiness at all. And silence, no matter how ornate the altar, is still a prison. You know this now. So the question becomes, what will you do with it? You've heard the hymns. You've seen the robes. You've walked the corridors where womanhood was undone in the name of sacred order. And now you're holding the story they buried. What happens next is up to you. Subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Because if we don't tell these stories, no one will. And if you choose to look away, then say so in the comments. Say why women turned into shadows. Still don't deserve to step back into the light. They buried them shallow. Not to preserve them, but to forget them faster. No gilded coffins. No sacred spells. No procession of mourners. Just silence and sand. And yet, the bodies would not stay silent. The bones remain. And bones don't lie. What the scribes refused to write, what the priests erased from the walls, what the pharaohs chose never to see, time recorded in calcium and marrow. Recent digs near Saqqara, Thebes, and the lesser temple grounds in Dendera have uncovered skeletons unlike any others in the region. Their pelvises fractured from strain. Their femurs, thick with unnatural stress. Spines compressed from long hours of standing still, motionless as stone, year after year. Their shoulders wide, arms hardened, not from battle, but from burden. The daily lifting, cleaning, guarding, scrubbing, tasks meant for many, shouldered by one. And the skulls. Small, feminine, but with jawlines tense from years of clenching. Teeth worn from chewing roots used to suppress hunger, from nights spent fasting beneath temple floors while others slept in silk. One body bore markings across her scalp. Pinpricks from years of repeated shaving, etched into the bone like tally marks of surrender. But what haunts most were the tattoos. Found beneath layers of resin and gold foil, some were still visible, faint blue ink at the temple, just above the brow. Symbols of Isis. But inverted. Not celebratory, restrictive. Marks placed not in reverence, but in ownership. A quiet branding that said, you belong to the gods. But not as a woman. Not as yourself. They were buried apart from the priestesses. Apart from the concubines. Apart from the laborers. Not elite enough for ceremony. Not lowly enough for mass graves. Placed in that same liminal nowhere they were forced to live. The archaeologists hesitate to name them. Some say eunuch is not the right word. Some argue they were simply servants, or sickly women, or deformed from birth. But the bones disagree. The bones speak clearly. These women lived like eunuchs. They were worked like men. They were erased like outcasts. And they died like no one. Not a single funerary amulet bore their names. Not a single clay tablet beside their corpses held a prayer. Only weight. Only scars. Still think this was metaphor? Still think history always tells the truth? If you're hearing this now, you are among the first in over 4,000 years to know that they existed. They left no diaries. No one mourned them at their graves. Are you really going to walk away without even subscribing to help finish their story? Go ahead. Comment why they're not worth remembering. Say it plainly. Say it out loud. So we can etch your silence beside theirs. History is not a record. It's a performance. A selection. A script whispered into the ears of kings, carved by the hands of scribes paid to remember what the powerful approved, and to forget everything else. And those women. The watchers, the shadows, the stripped and silenced, they didn't fit the story. So they were cut from it. Not because they lacked importance, but because they lacked permission. They weren't beautiful symbols of fertility. They weren't fierce warriors. They weren't tragic queens or romantic martyrs. They were inconvenient. They were needed, but never wanted. Seen, but never acknowledged. Touched by gods, but never divine. So history turned its face away, and the chisel followed suit. The scrolls speak of balance and justice. They speak of order. But where is the justice for a life spent in hollow service? Where is the balance in a death that leaves no name behind? The pharaoh's court recorded the grain count, the cattle totals, the length of each Nile flood. But not the names of the women who swept the chambers. Who bore no children but fed every royal infant. Who bled behind columns while hymns echoed in marble halls. Because their lives were not meant to be remembered. They were meant to be used. They were the scaffolding on which divinity was staged. The scaffolding is never meant to be seen. It only exists to hold up the illusion. But illusions crumble. And sand does not forget forever. And now the bones speak, the silence screams, the gaps in the hieroglyphs stare back with accusation. And the story unravels. What if history's greatest secret wasn't what it recorded, but what it buried? What if the erased outnumber the remembered? What if for every Cleopatra, there were 1,000 sachets, faceless, voiceless, used and discarded, whose suffering was too ordinary for legend, but too foundational to ignore? You're not just hearing a tale of ancient Egypt. You're witnessing the lie we've told ourselves across centuries, that history is truth. But it isn't. It's curated memory. It's survival, sold to the highest bidder. It's who the record keepers allowed to remain. And these women? They were not allowed. Now they ask something of you. Will you do what the pharaohs wouldn't? Will you remember? Or will you turn away like every generation before you? Subscribe to Disturbing Tale. Because forgetting is easy. But if you still believe their pain deserves a name, give them one. With your attention. With your voice. With the space they were denied. And if you won't, say why in the comments. Say why the scaffolding should stay invisible. Say why suffering in silence makes someone less worthy of remembrance. We'll be waiting. You can still hear them, can't you? Not in words. Not in sound. But in the spaces where their names should be. In the quiet between hieroglyphs. In the blank walls of temple corridors. In the air, heavy with what was done to keep them hidden. They are not ghosts. They are not myths. They are women, real, flesh and blood, who once stood behind the veil of god-kings and watched history being written, without a single line for them. They were not granted death rituals. They were not given tombs of gold or prayers in eternity's name. Because remembering them would mean admitting what was done. And empires do not confess. They erase. And still, through dust, through ruin, through the ache of every unanswered question, they remain. We know now what the priests would not say. What the scribes dared not write. What the pharaohs refused to see. They were made into no one. So that others could remain someone. But today, they have a name, female eunuchs of ancient Egypt. This is Disturbing Tale. We raise the dead, not with magic, but with memory. If you're not afraid to know the parts of history no one wants told, then hit subscribe. And if you won't, tell us in the comments what you're so afraid of. Say it loud. So the silence doesn't win again.